September 12th, 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The morning air felt cool and wet on his cheeks as he stepped from the back of the olive trucks and into the smell of pine and damp gravel. The parade ground was broad and flat, with low mist clinging to the trunks of the trees and softening the long lines of barracks. He kept his eyes on the canvas sack slung over his shoulder and the boots of the man in front of him. He was 24 years old, a corporal from a port city on the inland sea, and he had learned as a boy to grip a bat at the neighborhood field, to watch the summer tournaments at Cochien with the devotion that many of his classmates gave to calligraphy. That past felt distant now. He had been pulled from the sand and broken coral of Saipan after weeks of bombardment, had tasted salt and cordite in the caves, and had thrown down a rifle when the last order dissolved into smoke. It was the guard that surprised him first, because the face was young and a little embarrassed, and because the man spoke slow, careful Japanese with a Midwestern accent and said that the mess would serve hot food at once. The line moved toward a building that smelled of coffee and yeast. Inside, the room was bright, full of clatter and voices, and hands in white aprons were already setting trays on the counter. On his tray landed a pale, split bread roll with a pink sausage and mustard he did not know, beans sweet with molasses, a scoop of potatoes, a slice of tomato and lettuce, and a tall cup of cold, brown, foaming soda that smelled like winter spices. The guard called it root beer and smiled when he repeated the words. He had not tasted a sweet drink in months. He lifted the cup, and the first mouthful of foam surprised his tongue with sugar and a strange bark flavor, and he set the cup down quickly because his eyes had filled with tears he did not permit to fall. He took a breath that shook. The sausage was hot and oily, and it broke under the edge of the metal fork. He chewed and felt the weight of the bite move through him like a warm stone, and for a moment the noise of the room dimmed, and he saw his mother bend over a small charcoal grill on a winter day, turning a fish that crackled in the smoke. He kept eating because the guard said, "Eat, you are safe here," and because the body wanted salt and fat and sugar more than pride wanted silence. He did not know this bread. He did not know this drink. He knew only that both were a sign of a world he had not been taught to expect. The camp waited around him like a lesson arranged in straight lines. Camp McCoy had been built as a training post in Wisconsin farm country, and in 1944 it was one of the mainland posts that housed enemy prisoners under the rules of the Geneva Convention. There were thousands of German prisoners in the United States by that year, and there were also Japanese prisoners, a much smaller number by comparison, measured in the low thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands who fell into Allied hands in Europe. The difference came from the nature of the fighting in the Central and Southern Pacific, and from a code that taught many Japanese soldiers that capture was a stain that could not be washed out. On Saipan alone in June and July 1944, nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers died, while the Americans reported a few thousand prisoners, many of them wounded or stunned by bombardment, some of them drafted laborers or sailors who had been swept into ground fighting. Across the ocean that summer, American factories were building ships, trucks, aircraft, and radios in quantities that had become the signature of Allied strength. Steel plants poured thousands of tons daily, and West Coast shipyards launched cargo vessels in weeks, each one assembled from hundreds of thousands of parts sent by rail from dozens of states. Behind the gate at Camp McCoy, the prisoner compound conformed to a standard plan used across the system. Barracks were of wood, each with bunks, pot-bellied stoves for winter, electric lights that clicked on at dusk, and washrooms with hot water. The mess halls ran on schedules measured in minutes and servings measured in ounces and calories. The War Department logged costs per prisoner per day and menus by the week. Inspections recorded pounds of flour, crates of canned tomatoes, gallons of milk, and barrels of beans. The men from Saipan arrived by transport, were processed at points on the West Coast or in Hawaii, and then moved by rail to inland posts for security and distribution of labor under the convention. Each step generated forms, photographs, medical checks, and inoculation cards. The orderly flow of paper and trains and meals produced a pattern. It produced something less obvious as well, a steady erosion of ideas carried into the camp from other shores. When the corporal lifted the root beer again and swallowed, he was not only tasting sugar and wintergreen, he was tasting a contradiction. He had been told that the enemy was soft and crumbling. The bright bulb over his table did not flicker. The mess line did not stop. The young American guard who spoke to him in halting Japanese did not sneer. The guard pointed instead to the bin where empty cups went, to the enamel basin where the metal trays would be dropped, and to the sign on the wall that listed mealtimes for morning, noon, and evening. As the corporal followed these instructions, he felt that the structure of the day here was held together by rules rather than threats, and that the rules were firm and also casual, like the way the guard said, "Take more if you are still hungry." He looked out of the barracks window in the late afternoon and saw the shadows of pines creep across the packed earth. The work detail he had been assigned was light on this first day. He and a dozen others stacked firewood and swept the long barracks corridors, and he watched how the guards spoke with their hands on their hips, not on the stocks of their rifles. The air smelled of lumber and soap. He washed his face and neck, and the scabs on his knuckles stung, then settled into a small sting that he could ignore. He thought about the cave on Saipan, where he had crouched with a canteen that tasted of rust, about the night he had crawled through a drainage channel full of dust and grit, and about the morning when the shock wave from a naval shell had pushed him flat and left his ears ringing like a kettle. He did not know why he was alive when others were not. He did not know if the words that had guided him since training school still had weight. The smell of dinner began to creep through the screen. He had never eaten a hot dog before that day, and he had never tasted a drink that fizzed like that. In the evening, the mess offered stewed meat, potatoes, white bread, coffee if he wanted it, milk if he did not, and a slice of apple pie that made him think of harvests and ovens and of a kitchen he had never seen. He ate quietly, then folded his hands and sat with his back straight, because sitting like a soldier was a habit his muscles still remembered. On the walk back to the barracks, the guard told them that the camp would assign work off-post when the season demanded it. In Wisconsin, that meant farms and timber cutting. He listened without lifting his eyes, but he stored the words. He wondered about the farms, about barns full of hay and stalls full of cattle, and whether the barns had lights like the mess hall, and whether the lights burned all night. He tried to picture fields the way they appeared on the maps that had been shown in lectures before the landing. Fields broken into neat squares, roads that ran straight for miles, and houses set back under trees. His body tired, and he tried to sleep. He lay on the bunk, and the mattress felt soft and a little uneven, and there was a low current of voices around him as the others murmured in the half-light. He stared at the ceiling boards and counted slowly to help his mind settle. It settled not on the caves or the maps, but on the taste of the root beer, on the way the foam had met his lip like snow that did not melt cold but melted sweet, and on the way the hot sausage had cracked and released a smell of salt and fat that filled the throat. The simple act of eating something unfamiliar had opened a space where he could imagine that the life outside the fence might be large and varied and ordinary, and not only full of the uniforms and machines that had crushed his unit. By the time he woke, rolled his blanket, and joined the line for morning roll, the broader shape of his new world had begun to take form. Camp McCoy was one node in a system that stretched from the Great Plains to the Atlantic seaboard, and from the northern forests to the Gulf. In 1944, the United States held many enemy prisoners on the mainland, most of them German, and smaller numbers of Japanese, Italians, and other nationals captured at sea or in distant campaigns. The numbering of camps and the slung division between main posts and branch camps created an administrative map with hundreds of dots. Each dot drew inputs from warehouses and rail spurs. The warehouses drew from mills and refineries that in turn fed on iron ore from the Mesabi Range, coal from Pennsylvania and Illinois, wheat from Kansas, and fruit from California. Electricity hummed through this web, carried by copper wire strung on poles and bolted to transformers, and turned into motion by motors on conveyors and pump houses that filled water towers and fed kitchens and laundries. Even a single mess breakfast in a single camp reflected this scale. Eggs from farms, flour milled in the Midwest, sugar from cane or beets processed at refineries that turned out hundreds of tons per day, coffee shipped from Latin ports, milk from local dairies, all counted and stamped and scheduled by men who worked with clipboards and adding machines. The prisoners saw only the surface of this system. They saw trays and boiled coffee and white bread wrapped in waxed paper, and a cook who called out orders to the women and men under him. Yet even this surface could carry the weight of a lesson. A nation that could feed prisoners well, on time, and in quantity while fighting across two oceans was not a nation that teetered. His own army had fed him rice, tinned fish, and sometimes nothing at all in the last weeks on Saipan. And the gap between those weeks and this morning stretched inside him like an alley between buildings that rose high and blocked the light. He understood that American policy toward prisoners was not a kindness alone. It was a matter of treaty, a matter of calculation, and a matter of reputation. Good treatment could encourage surrender in future engagements. It could also set a standard to protect Americans in enemy hands. The men who ran the camp understood these reasons and could list them. But a man who stood with a tin cup and tasted a sweet drink did not need a policy brief to feel the effect. He could feel it in his throat and in his stomach, and in the way his shoulders loosened when he sat and ate without fear that the food would be taken away. He was sent out with a small work party 2 days later. The truck rattled past fields where corn stood tall and stalks shone pale at the joints and tassels bent under the weight of dew. They passed a farm with a silo like a tower and long low barns and 3 cars parked near a clapboard house under a maple. He counted the cars because private cars had been rare in his city before the war, and because fuel and tires were rationed in every nation now. And yet here, the yard held 3. A boy of perhaps 16 drove a tractor along the edge of a field, turned, and drove back, and the lines he cut were straight and even, like the lines on writing paper. The boy wore a cap and a short jacket, and he held the wheel with one hand and took a drink from a bottle with the other, then set the bottle back in a rack near the seat. The sight filled the corporal with a strange feeling, not envy alone, not anger alone, but the sense that he was looking at a place where the demands of war and the routines of life had not torn each other to pieces. In his country, even schoolboys were collecting scrap metal and pulling weeds in vegetable rows in empty lots. Here a boy could work and drink a soda and drive a machine that cost more than a house in his city. The guard explained that the prisoners would pick stones from a field and stack them at the edge so that plows would not jar and break. The field was broad, and a line of men could walk a long time before reaching the far edge. The work warmed his back. It made his palms sore, and he did not mind that because sore hands felt honest. At noon they sat on the grass near a fence and ate their lunches, and one of the farm women brought a jug of water with ice clinking inside. The ice clicked against the tin cups like small bells. The woman said something in English, and the guard translated. She asked if they had enough. She asked if anyone was ill. Her hands were red from washing, and her hair was pulled back, and she wore a simple cotton dress. The corporal looked down and said, "Yes, enough, thank you." He did not know what to do with the gentleness that bent toward him from the most ordinary gestures. He lifted his face and watched a line of swallows dive and rise over the barn roof. He remembered the sound of aircraft on Saipan and how he had trained himself to judge their size and direction by the tone. And he listened now to the swallows and tried to imagine a life in which the only flight one judged was a bird. The rest of that day passed in a rhythm that made sense to his arms and back. When the truck returned them to the gate in the late afternoon, the light on the parade ground was gold, and the barracks were busy with men washing and shaving and folding shirts. He lined up for the evening meal and found that the mess was serving hot dogs again because it was a quick supper on a day when several work details returned late. He lifted the sausage, cut it carefully, and ate it slowly this time to study the flavor. He tried the root beer in small sips, and the taste that had shocked him now seemed like a sign of a world that made different choices and delighted in different small pleasures. He did not smile as he ate. He held himself still, but inside something softened like clay in warm hands. The wind off the prairie turned sharp as autumn crept into Wisconsin. By late September, the maples outside the wire fence burned red and orange, and frost glazed the puddles that gathered along the gravel walks between the barracks. The corporal learned to wrap his blanket tight and to keep his socks dry. He worked most days with a group of 15 men from Saipan and Guam, clearing brush near the perimeter or hauling timber to the sheds that warmed the kitchens. On the good days, when the air was bright and the guards in mild humor, he found a quiet rhythm in the repetition. His hands grew calloused again, and his shoulders settled into the patient motion of lifting, stacking, tying, and stepping aside. In the evenings, he would sit on the edge of his bunk and write short lines in the notebook that he had made from scraps of ledger paper. The notebook had come from a camp office clerk who had smiled and handed it over without words. He wrote about the color of the trees, about the way the camp loudspeaker carried music from the administration building at night, and about the flavor of the food that he was still learning to describe. "The bread is soft and white like clouds," he wrote. "The drink that foams tastes of sweetness and tree bark. They call it root beer." When a guard noticed his writing, he asked what language it was. The corporal replied softly, "Japanese," and the guard nodded and said, "Looks neat. My sister writes like that too, only in shorthand." The guard grinned, not knowing the gulf he had stepped across with the ease of a boy tossing a stone. Across the ocean that same September, the war tightened in opposite directions. American forces moved north from New Guinea and west from the Marianas, and the Navy pushed deeper toward the Philippines. In the Pacific, the contrast between the front and the home front grew sharper each month. The United States had over 16 million men in uniform by that autumn, yet its fields, factories, and shipyards still overflowed with output. In a single week, the steel industry poured nearly 2 million tons of ingots, while automobile plants converted their assembly lines to build aircraft engines, tanks, and trucks at rates never before seen. The War Department's Quartermaster Corps managed supplies for the camps through an intricate chain that linked the prisoner kitchens to the same logistical arteries feeding troops in Europe and the Pacific. Every pound of flour and every crate of apples that entered Camp McCoy had a form, a number, and a destination tag. To the men behind the fence, these were invisible systems, but they could feel their presence in the punctual arrival of breakfast, in the endless supply of clean utensils, and in the humming lights that never dimmed. The corporal often stared at the electric bulbs and tried to imagine how much coal, copper, and oil it took to keep them glowing. He remembered that in his city before the war, only certain neighborhoods had steady electricity, and the rest lived by kerosene lamps and candles. Now he was a prisoner in a land where even barns had wiring, and it was this abundance, more than any military weapon, that began to unravel the certainties drilled into him as a soldier. When October arrived, the farm crews changed rotation. The corporal was assigned to work in a dairy processing plant attached to a cooperative that supplied milk to the army. It was the first time he had seen a production line outside a factory district in Japan. The building stood near the rail siding, its interior bright and smelling of steam and metal. He was given gloves and instructed to rinse the bottles that came down a conveyor before they were filled and capped by a churning machine. The noise was steady, the motion mechanical, and the American foreman counted the output not in dozens or hundreds, but in thousands per hour. The corporal counted in his head and lost track. He watched how each worker performed a narrow task and how every step fit into the next. The guards kept to the background, talking quietly with the plant staff. No one shouted, and when the machine jammed, the foreman stopped the line with a switch, cleared the obstruction, and started it again. He told the prisoners to step back, to be careful, and said safety first. The words puzzled the corporal, because in his service years, safety had never been a priority. Machines had been tools of necessity, not of care. When the day ended, each worker was given a sandwich, a bottle of milk, and sometimes a sweet bun if the batch ran large. The corporal ate his sandwich slowly in the truck, staring at the white bread and the slice of ham that seemed almost luxurious. Around him the others murmured softly. One of them, an older sailor, said that he had heard of such bread only in the kitchens of naval officers. The corporal said nothing. He thought about the hot dog on his first day, about the taste of root beer, and now this sandwich that was given freely, not as a reward, not as bait, but as routine. He wondered what kind of country could treat captured men with such casual plenty. That winter, Camp McCoy received several shipments of prisoners transferred from other camps, and the population grew to nearly 3,000. The cold came early, and the men from the Pacific Islands struggled to adjust. Frost painted the windows, and snow fell in thick, silent waves across the parade ground. The corporal had never seen snow before. The guards issued heavier coats and gloves, and the barrack stoves burned around the clock. Inside the warmth, the smell of pine smoke mixed with the scent of soap and wet wool. At night, the corporal lay awake listening to the sound of snow sliding from the roof. In December, the camp administration arranged a Christmas meal. Though the prisoners did not share the holiday, they were served the same dinner as the guards and civilian staff: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, vegetables, and pie. The corporal hesitated before taking his tray. The guard, a sergeant from Ohio, said, "Eat. Everybody eats tonight." The corporal sat, tasted the turkey, and felt again that strange, hollow ache that had opened inside him since his capture. He had seen destruction on an unimaginable scale, had marched through ruin and fire, and yet here, in captivity, he faced an enemy that fed him, clothed him, and treated him not as an animal but as a man. He could not decide whether that kindness was mercy or humiliation. Later he learned that the same camp system fed hundreds of thousands of German prisoners with similar meals, that it was not personal kindness but a national standard. Still, the taste remained. He wrote in his notebook that night, "They say this food is ordinary. I think it is their strength. The enemy who wastes nothing of effort, but wastes much of comfort, is one we never understood." By early 1945, the snow began to retreat from the fields, and the ground softened into long bands of mud and thawed earth. The corporal had lived half a year within the rhythm of the camp. He could now speak a few words of English, enough to follow orders without translation. He knew the names of the guards who rotated on the outer posts, and he could recognize the smell of meals hours before they were served. The camp library, set up by the Red Cross, had shelves of English books and a small collection of Japanese texts that had arrived through prisoner exchange. He borrowed a grammar guide and began to copy simple phrases each evening. The act of learning, quiet and repetitive, gave him a kind of balance. When he thought back to the island caves and the weeks before surrender, the noise and heat of that world felt like another life. What replaced it was not comfort, but routine, and the steady hum of machines that never stopped. When the trucks rolled out each morning to the farms, to the lumber yards, to the canneries, and to the rail depots, the camp seemed like an extension of the industrial world around it. The prisoners were small parts of a larger mechanism. They stacked lumber, sorted beans, repaired crates, or cleared snow from the tracks. Each motion fit somewhere in the web of production that linked this quiet Wisconsin post to the factories and shipyards across the continent. The corporal came to understand that every meal he ate, every bulb that lit above his bunk, drew power from a nation that ran like a great engine, steady and immense. He did not love this place, but he could not hate it either. That same winter, America's war effort had reached its highest peak. In February, factories produced more than 8,000 aircraft and over 50,000 trucks. In shipyards along the coasts, Liberty and Victory ships slid into the water at a rate of nearly one every 4 hours. The country consumed coal by the millions of tons each week and drew oil from wells that pumped night and day. The contrast between this vast, ordered abundance and the shortages that plagued every island and city in Japan grew sharper with each passing month. American newspapers, available through the camp's information office, spoke of rationing, but the word had a different meaning here. Even with restrictions, the stores in nearby Sparta and Toma were full. Guards returned from leave with boxes of fruit, cakes, and small radios. The prisoners saw them and tried not to stare. The corporal realized that even in wartime, American civilians lived with comfort and choice. He could not imagine what that meant for their morale, their strength, or their capacity to fight. He had been taught that hardship bred courage and that luxury weakened nations. But this war had disproved that lesson. The soldiers who had captured him were well-fed, well-equipped, and relentless. The nation that produced them was not soft. It was a machine that turned abundance into power. In the spring, the corporal was assigned to a new duty at a nearby canning plant. The plant processed vegetables from farms across the county, sealing thousands of cans each day for shipment to army depots. The machines filled the air with a metallic rhythm, the sound of progress repeating itself endlessly. He worked beside American women, most of them farmers' wives and daughters, who replaced men sent to war. They spoke little to him, but they nodded in greeting, and sometimes one would hand him a sandwich during the lunch break. The sandwiches were thick with sliced meat and lettuce, and the bread was white and soft. The corporal could not refuse. He had once believed that enemy women would treat him with contempt, but these women seemed indifferent and practical. They worked quickly, their hands moving in time with the conveyor belts, and they laughed easily among themselves. He began to sense that in this country, women carried a power of their own, not by rank or law, but by participation. He had never imagined such a sight before the war. The world he knew had been arranged in strict layers: officer and enlisted, man and woman, master and laborer. Here, as in this plant, everyone moved with the same purpose. Every can sealed, every box stacked, and every meal packed for soldiers overseas was part of the same rhythm that had swallowed his homeland's hopes of victory. By May 1945, the news of Germany's surrender reached the camp. The guards fired a small volley into the air to celebrate, and the loudspeaker played music through the afternoon. The corporal did not understand the lyrics, but he could hear the joy in the voices of the guards and the workers. The war in Europe was over, but the Pacific still burned. Rumors spread among the prisoners that Japan would fight to the last man, that the homeland had been bombed heavily, that new weapons had appeared. He listened, but said nothing. He had stopped believing in rumors. The only truths he trusted were the ones he could see: the lights that stayed on, the trucks that never stopped rolling, the endless supply of food that filled each mess hall. He knew that his country could not match such things. When he walked between the rows of barracks at night and saw the light pooling on the snowmelt, he thought of his city on the inland sea. He wondered if it still stood, if the lights there were dark, if his family was alive. He tried to picture the harbor with its fishing boats and canneries, but the image wavered like something remembered from childhood. He wrote one more note in his small notebook. I see now that strength can wear a smile. Power can speak softly. We learned the wrong kind of pride. He folded the notebook and hid it under his mattress, uncertain if he would ever carry it home. Summer arrived early in 1945. The fields around Camp McCoy turned green again, and the snowmelt gave way to tall grass that swayed under the weight of insects and the hum of heat. The corporal's days followed a familiar routine now. He rose at dawn, lined up for roll call, worked through the morning, ate at noon, returned in the afternoon, and read or wrote at night. Each repetition stripped away a little more of the soldier's identity that had once governed his every breath. The sound of orders shouted in Japanese, the stiff rituals of salute and report, the constant expectation of death. These were gone. What replaced them was something quieter and far stranger: choice. When the guards told the prisoners they could attend classes in English, agriculture, or simple mechanics, he hesitated at first, but curiosity won. He joined a class that met twice a week in a converted barracks room. The instructor was a young American corporal who spoke slowly and used chalk drawings to explain words like freedom, industry, and democracy. The prisoners listened with careful faces. Some stared at the floor. Others took notes. The corporal wrote down the word freedom again and again, trying to understand its many meanings. In his country, the word had been used in speeches about the emperor and the nation's destiny. Here it seemed to mean something closer to daily life, to the right to speak, to work, to live without fear. He did not know if that was truly possible, yet he could see in the guards and the workers a kind of calm that came from belonging to a system that did not need shouting or punishment to function. Beyond the camp, the war neared its end. In March and April, American forces invaded Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the losses were staggering. Nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers died on Okinawa, along with tens of thousands of civilians. American casualties were counted in the tens of thousands as well. Reports filtered through the camp slowly, but the prisoners knew enough to sense the inevitable. Japan's empire had shrunk to the homeland itself, and American bombers now reached every major city. The corporal could not imagine what Tokyo looked like under fire, or what his hometown had become. Sometimes, when guards allowed the prisoners to read newspapers, he saw small black and white photographs of smoking ruins captioned with words like Yokohama, Kobe, and Osaka. He traced the outlines of those places with his eyes and then folded the paper away. In the same pages, he saw other photographs of factories, of harvests, of assembly lines filled with women and men building weapons faster than the war could destroy them. The numbers made no sense to him. Millions of tons of steel, billions of rounds of ammunition, thousands of ships. The scale was so vast that it felt like natural law, as if the land itself produced abundance by instinct. The prisoners whispered among themselves that America's power came not from cruelty or conquest, but from organization and energy that seemed limitless. He did not know how to explain it to himself, except to note that everything here ran on time and nothing ever stopped. In late July, the corporal was transferred to a branch camp near Prairie du Chien, where prisoners worked harvesting wheat and barley. The open land shocked him. The horizon stretched unbroken, and the fields glowed gold under the sun. He had never seen such size in a single farm. In Japan, farms were small, carved into hillsides and divided by narrow paths. Here, a single family could manage hundreds of acres with machines that roared and spat dust. He watched combines move across the fields, cutting and threshing in a single sweep. Each machine did the work of 100 men, and it never tired. When the day ended, the guard explained that the grain from these fields would travel by rail to mills in Minnesota and Chicago, then to bakeries and army depots, and finally across the ocean to feed troops and prisoners alike. The thought humbled him. The bread he ate at breakfast might have begun its life in a field just like this one, far from the war and the noise of destruction. The land itself was part of the machine that had conquered him. He worked quietly, feeling the heat rise through his boots, the smell of cut wheat thick in his throat. When they rested at noon, the farmers shared cold bottles of root beer again, and he drank slowly this time, no longer shocked by the taste but still amazed by the abundance. The bottles were thrown into a wooden crate after the meal. The waste seemed careless, but the farmer said they would be collected and refilled. Even the waste had a system here. August 1945 brought news that shook the camp in ways silence could not contain. The loudspeaker announced that Japan had surrendered. The guards stood quietly as the interpreter repeated the message in Japanese. Some prisoners wept. Others stared at the ground, unable to believe the words. The corporal felt a hollow space open in his chest. For months he had known this day would come, yet he had not known what it would mean. Now he understood. The war was over, but he no longer knew who he was. He returned to the barracks that night and opened his notebook. He wrote, "We are told the emperor spoke to the people. They say his voice was calm. I wonder if he sounded as calm as the guard who brings our meals." He closed the book and looked out the window. Fireflies drifted above the grass, and the sound of a train echoed across the dark fields. Somewhere beyond that horizon, ships were loading supplies and troops for homecoming. Others would soon carry prisoners like him back across the Pacific. He imagined the long voyage, the cities in ruin, and the faces of those who had never known that an enemy could feed you, teach you, and still win completely. He lay back on the bunk and let the stillness settle. In that moment, surrounded by the hum of electric lights and the faint scent of pine, he realized that victory and defeat were smaller things than the vast difference between despair and order. What broke him first had not been hunger or loss, but the taste of sweetness he could not explain, the warm food that did not run out, and the simple power of a system that never faltered. September 1945 brought a quiet unlike any the corporal had known since childhood. The camp still functioned, but its purpose had shifted. The guards no longer spoke with the sharpness of wartime, and the officers spent more time filling out forms than giving orders. The Americans were already thinking of home. The prisoners were thinking of return as well, but the word home no longer carried a clear shape. The corporal had lived behind the wire for more than a year. He had eaten, worked, and slept under the rhythm of a system that treated routine as sacred. He had learned to recognize the whistle of the supply train that passed each dawn, bringing flour, canned meat, and paper goods from depots in Chicago and Milwaukee. He had learned the names of machines, the names of crops, the smell of oil and fertilizer, and the feel of soft soil that grew food in abundance. Now, he was told, he would soon see the Pacific again. The War Department had begun organizing the return of Japanese prisoners. They would be transported first to a processing center at Fort Sam Houston, then to the coast, and finally by ship to Yokohama. He tried to imagine that port, the ruins, and the sight of the American flag flying above it. He could not. The only America he knew was this place of snow, wheat, pine, and hot dogs. He thought often of that first meal, how the warmth of it had frightened him, how the sweetness had undone his pride. That memory followed him like a quiet ghost. In October, the repatriation began in earnest. Groups of prisoners were gathered, counted, vaccinated again, and issued clean clothing marked PW. The corporal's group was sent by train south through Illinois and Missouri. The journey revealed a landscape more vast than he had imagined. Mile after mile of farmland rolled past the windows, each field bordered by neat fences, each small town with water towers, grain elevators, and houses painted white. Every station they passed had lights, cars, and people moving with ease. It was the same abundance he had seen before, but now he knew it belonged to an entire continent. The prisoners whispered as they traveled, some astonished, others silent. One man muttered that this country's strength was not in its soldiers, but in its farmers and machines. The corporal nodded without speaking. When the train stopped at a siding near St. Louis, the guards allowed them to stretch their legs. He smelled diesel, bread, and roasting coffee from somewhere nearby. Across the yard, American workers unloaded freight cars filled with canned food. He counted the crates. There were thousands, stacked higher than a man could reach. It reminded him again that America's war was fought not only with weapons, but with production so vast that even its prisoners had eaten better than many civilians in Asia. He stood still and watched until the whistle blew for departure. When he returned to his seat, he saw his reflection in the glass. A thin face, clean-shaven, eyes older than his age. He looked like neither soldier nor civilian. By November, his group reached Fort Sam Houston in Texas. The air was dry and the horizon stretched flat and endless. The processing center was orderly, with barracks, medical tents, and officers' offices laid out in straight rows. Here, thousands of prisoners, Japanese, German, and Italian, were classified, questioned, and prepared for departure. The corporal underwent another medical exam and was asked to fill a questionnaire about his experience. He hesitated over the questions. "How were you treated?" it said. "What was your impression of the United States?" He wrote carefully. "The food was always enough. The people were calm. The work was steady. I think I learned that power does not need to shout." He handed the form to the clerk, who read it, nodded, and placed it in a folder. The next day, he was assigned to a ship departing from Seattle. The train ride north took days. Outside the windows, he saw the plains give way to mountains, the rivers widening, and the forests deepening into tall, dark walls. The land itself seemed inexhaustible. At one station, guards distributed boxed meals, sandwiches, apples, and small bottles of root beer. He drank slowly, savoring the taste that had marked the beginning of his captivity. It no longer felt foreign. It tasted of transition. In December 1945, the ship carrying him left Seattle. Its decks were crowded with men in khaki uniforms marked PW. Their faces turned east toward the ocean. The voyage lasted 2 weeks. The Pacific stretched vast and indifferent beneath a gray winter sky. The prisoners spent most of the time below deck, talking softly, reading, or staring into space. When the coast of Japan appeared, a faint line of hills and smoke, a murmur ran through the crowd. Yokohama lay in ruins. The harbor was filled with wrecks and cranes, the skeletons of warehouses, and a forest of American flags on newly built piers. The corporal stood at the rail and felt an ache that was both grief and relief. The war that had begun for him in pride and certainty ended here in exhaustion and disbelief. When he stepped ashore, a Japanese officer recorded his name, rank, and origin. The man behind the desk looked older and thinner, and his uniform hung loose. He told the corporal that his hometown had been damaged, but not destroyed. The corporal nodded, but the words felt distant. He had seen too much of another world to return easily to the old one. That night, sleeping in a makeshift barracks on Japanese soil, he thought of the endless fields, the lights that never flickered, the hum of machinery, and the simple warmth of a meal shared without hatred. He realized that captivity had changed him more deeply than he had ever expected. The war had taken everything he believed and replaced it with quiet respect for the power of ordinary life. He closed his eyes and listened to the faint rumble of trucks outside, American vehicles moving through a defeated land. He felt no bitterness, only a strange calm. What had conquered him was not cruelty, but the undeniable proof that a society of abundance and discipline could win not just battles, but hearts. January 1946 arrived with cold winds sweeping across the devastated plains of Honshu. The corporal's journey home took him through Tokyo, then west toward his small port city on the inland sea. He traveled by train, sitting among other returnees whose faces carried the same hollow exhaustion. The cities they passed were flattened to dust. Smoke still rose from burned-out districts, and steel skeletons of factories reached into gray skies like broken hands. The corporal could hardly connect these ruins with the abundance he had seen in America. When the train stopped in Osaka, he stepped onto the platform and found silence where there had once been crowds. The station roof was gone, replaced by temporary scaffolding and tarpaulin. Relief workers handed out rice balls and tea to travelers. He accepted both and bowed. The taste was familiar, but the portion small. It reminded him that the balance of the world had shifted. In America, food had been wastefully plentiful. Here, every grain was counted. He realized then that the true defeat was not only military, but material. Japan had lost its capacity to provide for itself, and with it, the illusion of superiority that had once driven its empire. When he finally reached his hometown, he found the harbor quiet but intact. Fishing boats lay anchored in neat lines, many patched with boards of mismatched color. Warehouses stood half-collapsed, their roofs sagging from bomb blasts and salt corrosion. His family home had survived, though its windows were broken and the walls scarred. His mother wept when she saw him. His father, thinner and stooped, simply nodded and said, "You returned." They ate together that night in a single room warmed by a charcoal brazier. The meal was rice mixed with barley and a small piece of pickled radish. As he lifted the bowl, he remembered the abundance of Camp McCoy, the trays of steaming food, the meat, the vegetables, the milk. He had been fed better as a prisoner than he was now as a free man. The thought filled him with shame and confusion. He wanted to describe what he had seen, the lights that never went out, the machines that never stopped, the kindness that came without hesitation. But he could not find the words. His parents asked about the camp, and he simply said, "We worked. We ate." He did not tell them about the root beer or the soft bread or the quiet respect the guards had shown. Some truths were too heavy to explain. Over the following months, Japan began to rebuild under American occupation. The corporal watched foreign soldiers patrol streets that had once been symbols of national pride. They carried cameras and notebooks, inspecting ports, schools, and factories. He was surprised by their discipline. There was no cruelty, no arrogance, only an efficient orderliness that reminded him of the camp. The Americans brought with them supplies, flour, milk powder, and canned meat. Soon, markets began to open again, selling imported goods wrapped in labels written in English. The corporal walked through one of these markets and saw a crate marked Campbell's Soup. The logo struck him like a memory. He realized he had seen the same brand in a factory near Wisconsin, where prisoners had unloaded cans for shipment. He stared at it for a long time before the vendor asked if he wished to buy some. He shook his head. It felt as though two worlds had folded into one moment, the conqueror's abundance flowing into the land of the defeated. He understood now that Japan's future would depend not on rebuilding its empire, but on learning from the system that had defeated it. That spring, the American occupation authorities launched food relief programs that distributed bread and powdered milk in schools. The corporal's younger brother, still a student, came home one day carrying a small roll of white bread and said, "They call this American bread." The corporal smiled faintly. He tore off a piece and tasted it. It was soft and warm, faintly sweet, the same texture that had once broken him in the camp. His brother laughed at his expression, but he said nothing. In that taste, he felt the strange bridge between captivity and survival. America's power was no longer that of weapons, but of sustenance, feeding the people it had defeated, proving that prosperity could win where ideology had failed. He walked to the harbor that evening and watched fishermen repair their nets. The sun set red over the water, and he thought of the miles of wheat fields, the humming factories, the cold root beer bottles in crates, and the steady hum of electric light. Everything he had witnessed as a prisoner somehow seemed like a lesson meant to prepare him for this, understanding that strength was not found in conquest, but in creation. The war had ended, but the influence of what he had seen would not fade. In the years to come, he would find work again, first as a dockhand, then as a clerk in a shipping office. And each time he handled an American crate or typed an English invoice, he would remember the quiet power that had changed him. By 1947, Japan had begun to find its footing again. Reconstruction programs funded by the Allied occupation brought electricity back to towns that had lain in darkness since the raids. The corporal, now a civilian clerk at the Port Authority, worked beside American engineers who supervised shipments of grain, steel, and machinery. He had become fluent enough in English to translate invoices and customs documents. Every day he handled goods that came from places he could still see clearly in his memory: Kansas wheat, Illinois machinery, Wisconsin canned milk. The same states that had supplied the camps now supplied the rebuilding of Japan. When he walked through the warehouses, he often paused before the crates stenciled with American town names. They were symbols of a cycle he understood better than most. The abundance that had conquered him was now sustaining his country's rebirth. In quiet moments, he thought of the guards who had smiled at him across the fence, the women in the canning factory, the endless light of the camp at night. He no longer felt humiliation when he remembered them. He felt a strange gratitude. The kindness that had once broken his pride had, over time, rebuilt his understanding of what civilization could be. That same year, the American Occupation Administration began reducing troop presence. Civil authority returned to Japanese hands, though guided by new laws drafted under American supervision. Newspapers printed words like democracy, freedom, and economic reform with an unfamiliar confidence. The corporal watched these changes with cautious hope. He had seen how democracy functioned, not as a slogan, but as order, the rule of law, the stability of work, the guarantee of food. He remembered how every crate of supplies had a number, how every man had a task, and how every light stayed lit because someone had planned it so. That was democracy as he had experienced it in the camp: structure, responsibility, and abundance shared through cooperation. The politicians in Tokyo spoke of rebuilding national spirit, but he knew that the truer challenge was rebuilding national systems. Without reliable power, industry, or transport, spirit meant little. And so he kept working quietly, moving goods, checking inventories, and helping rebuild the network that tied ports to factories and factories to people. In 1948, he received a letter from one of the American guards at Camp McCoy. The handwriting was large and careful, the English simple. "I hope you are home safe," it said. "I think of those winters. I still drink root beer and think how strange it must have tasted to you then." The letter enclosed a small photograph of the camp taken after the war. The barracks were empty now, the fence taken down, the fields turned to farmland again. He stared at the photograph for a long time. It was not the image of captivity, but of transformation. That place had been a mirror, in which he had seen his own beliefs collapse and something new emerge. He wrote a reply in English, thanking the guard for his kindness and telling him that Japan was rebuilding. He did not mention the hunger still felt in many towns or the slow recovery of industry. He ended with, "I remember the light in winter. It showed me that strength can be quiet." Months later, He received another letter with a photograph of a Midwestern street lined with houses and parked cars. The guard wrote, "This is my town. We built it from the same steel we used in the war. Maybe one day, your town will look like this." By 1950, Japan's economy had begun to stir. New factories rose from the ruins, powered by electricity from dams built under American direction. The port where he worked now bustled again, with ships carrying textiles, timber, and machinery. The corporal, now simply a man among many workers, watched these vessels sail toward horizons that once meant battle and now meant trade. He had aged, but carried himself with calm purpose. Sometimes, when younger workers asked about his time as a prisoner, he would say only, "I learned what makes a strong country." They pressed him for stories, but he rarely shared details. He preferred to let the lesson rest beneath the surface, like the foundation of the new buildings rising across Japan. Yet in his private thoughts, he often returned to that first bewildering taste of a hot dog, the fizz of root beer on his tongue, and the realization that power could be gentle. In those simple moments of captivity, he had seen the future. It was not the empire promised by propaganda, nor the poverty of defeat, but the discipline of creation, the steady hum of a society that built, fed, and forgave. Years later, when the lights of his rebuilt city glowed over the harbor once more, he would tell his son that freedom was not something spoken or given. It was something organized. It was the quiet ability of a people to make abundance and to share it, even with those who once wished them harm.